remember to buy a copy of your favorite books from the Cheeky Merchants. If we don't have it, we'll source it for you, but we'll definitely find the book for you. Hello, Cheeky Natives! Welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. I don't know what to call it, but this year has been absolutely mesmerizing. I think Tlhogonolo and I are on an absolute roll, and tonight's guest is absolutely going to cement what I'm about to say. But before I get too carried away, Tlhogonolo, how are you? Welcome to the Cheeky Natives. It's been a while.
Thank you very much. I just want to say to you, I know personally I harassed you about this book, because when I finished it, I was like, you better finish this book. Because I'm reaching out. You better finish this book. So
no pressure.
I'm really, really excited about this book. And I suppose an interesting story is what you then went to Ethiopia after you read the book, right? And tell us a little bit of why Ethiopia is important for our guest and the book we're going to talk about today.
You know what? I think that I don't want to give too much away. I think that when we have the discussion, people will realize why Ethiopia was so important and why particularly I had to go to Emperor Haile Selassie's bedroom and make sure that I got a shot of the book in the bedroom. So if you read the first few pages of this book, you will realize like why getting to Haile Selassie's bedroom, I went through it all, right? Because I didn't speak the language. Very few people spoke English. It was me, Google Translate, and their version of Uber, but we made it. But it was really just so beautiful to have read the book and then being able to do that. So I'm super excited. But before we go even further, allow me to introduce our wonderful guest. We have Safiya Sinclair, who was born in Montego Bay, Jamaica. She's the author of Cannibal, which won a Whiting Writers Award and the OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Poetry, among others, and was a finalist for the Seamus Hearney First Book Award and was long-listed for the Dylan Thomas Prize. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, and elsewhere. She is also the author of How to Say Babylon. Welcome, Safiya.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's also exciting because you've also been longlisted for the inaugural nonfiction award for the Women's Prize. How does that feel to form part of the first cohort of the nonfiction prize?
It feels wonderful. I mean, it was such an honor to be part of, that inaugural Women's Prize. And it was about time that somebody, gave this kind of attention to women writing nonfiction, right? Which many people have this idea of it's a male-dominated space, or, if women writing nonfiction isn't as serious as men writing, which is ridiculous, So I love the work that they're doing over there at the Women's Prize to really change that kind of thinking about, women writing nonfiction.
Listen, I'm definitely holding all thumbs, all nails, everything that can be held for How to Say Babylon to come out as the winner of the inaugural prize for nonfiction, because wow, absolutely wow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
This is the year of the memoir. Tlhogonolo knows that this year for me has just been the year of memoir, personal writing, and I feel like the memoirists have come in guns blazing. But I'm fascinated by the genre of memoir writing. I think that memoir writing is excavation, because what it does is to often force the writer to bring forth unknown and sometimes hidden histories. And I guess my question is, why was it important for you to write this memoir as an act of writing against the amnesia? Because people who read the book, they will realize that in as much as this is a personal history, this is also a history of the Rastafari. It's also a history of Jamaica. And there's something very interesting about memoir writing as a vehicle to write against historical amnesia, but also colonial erasure.
Yes. I love that term, historical amnesia. And, as you say, it was important for me as a Jamaican woman and a Jamaican writer to expand the kind of things I had already been writing about in my poetry. So I see the memoir as an expansion of, themes that had already been fascinating me in my poetry. I write about colonial erasure. I write about Caribbean selfhood, about Jamaican womanhood. I write about family. I write about, I write from an anti-colonial place. And so it was important for me to expand that in the memoir and to tell my story in a way that would reach as many people as it could, particularly because Jamaica has this really, I think Jamaica holds this really large space in the global cultural imagination. And a lot of that is rooted in Rastafari culture and reggae music. And I think when people think about Jamaica, they kind of think Rastafari is a thing that is a definitive, cultural marker of Jamaica. And also Rastafari itself, I think, to people around the globe is a male-dominated faith. Reggae is a male-dominated, genre of music. I think when people think Rastafari, they think of a man. And so for me, growing up as a young Rasta girl, a young Rasta woman, I wanted to really re-narrativize some of these stereotypes that people have about Jamaica and about Rastafari, and to also give a closer look of what it is like growing up as a young Rasta woman. What it's like for women and girls inside of Rastafari. And so, I kind of began there, no pressure. There's a lot to take on, right? And to also think about the ways that Rastafari history intertwines with Jamaican history and colonial history in Jamaica, right? Rastafari was founded from an anti-colonial root. Rastafari was born out of, in the early 1930s, when Jamaica was still under British colonial rule. That's when the Rastafari movement began, a space of empowerment for Black people in Jamaica and for the citizens who didn't have a lot of rights at the time. And then, Rastafari evolved in many different ways, but I knew I needed to touch on all these different historical touch points. There was no way to tell my story and my connection to Rastafari without also giving the whole historical context of Rastafari culture and colonial erasures, as you say.
Normally, memoirs are just what it is, right?
Yeah.
For me, I feel that while this is about Safiya Sinclair, it's a particularly Jamaican memoir, and you call it a Jamaican memoir because I think you wanted to speak, as you're saying, about this kind of context of Jamaica and Rastafari. And you spoke about this idea of colonialism, and people who themselves have been colonized, right, are often people who also perpetuate kind of this violence, right? So you think about the title, for instance, How to Say Babylon, and the concept in which you speak about how your father taught us what Babylon is. And I wanted you to speak about that a little bit, right? About Babylon at home, as opposed to Babylon in the way that we understand it as a state.
Yeah, it's so interesting because one of the things I wanted to do in writing the book is to give the reader a deep sense of what it was like inside of my house, right? Every day that we woke up, my father truly believed that there was this looming threat of the outside world, that Babylon, what the Rastafari call Babylon, which is to them a representation of everything that is oppressing the Black man, that's downtrodden the Rasta man. For them, Babylon is, any ideology that's rooted in colonialism, Western ideologies, capitalism, slavery, racism, what they say, ism and schism. To them, that's all Babylon, right? So to my father, the world was such a binary place, right? It was you were either all good or you're all bad. You were either pure or you were a heathen. And to him, anybody who wasn't Rastafari was Babylon. So, it was an interesting thing leaving the house and going to school and having to encounter children who were curious about Rastafari, had never seen Rasta children. My teachers treated me badly, and to kind of interact and make my own kind of quantifications about Babylon. At first when I was younger, I would like be looking at everybody. So this is Babylon. So this is the Babylon, that my father is talking about. And as I grew older, I had more questions. But, when I was younger, it was such an interesting way to think that everything outside of the gate was Babylon. Me and my siblings were tasked with being the best at everything, as pure as we could be, as righteous as we could be, which is, that's like a burden that no child can really carry. So it was certainly a very unique way of slowly learning all the different, ways of Babylon as my father defined it, Babylon as I, soon came to see it when I was older, and trying to sort of make sense of all of it on the page.
And I think that is the perfect segue to think around my next question, and that is around silence, right? There is this expectation that for Rastafari women particularly, that silence and not taking up too much space was also maintaining a kind of purity that you've spoken to. It's almost like a proof of goodness, right? That silence itself is a reward, but also this proof of goodness, right?
Yes.
And I think of this memoir as a deliberate act of rebellion against the Rastafari ideas of what women's goodness is, but also reclamation of women's agency, right? You write against the silence, and in many ways you write truthfully in ways that may not paint some of the Rastafari men in your life in the most ideal light. And there's a thing about taking back the silence and reclaiming the agency. And I'm curious about why you chose to use this memoir as a deliberate act of rebellion in the way that you did.
Thank you. I see my poetry as my first rebellion, right? So poetry actually was the first way that I sort of nurtured my voice. I sort of reclaimed my right to speak, that I broke the silence. It was first through poetry. And then, then the memoir is a continuation of that. But it is true, as you say, like, the Rasta brethren, a lot of them see a woman's highest virtue. And I was always told growing up, a woman's highest virtue was her silence, her obedience, and her pliance. Right. So for my father, when I was growing up, and other Rasta brethren, for them, a woman was supposed to be humble. And for them, that meant silent. It meant taking up no space. It meant also being sort of the handmaiden, to be silent and take up no space, but to always be there to attend to the man's needs as well. And so I immediately began to question that, like almost immediately. By the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I was like, wait, I don't think that sounds quite right to me. And I think because I was so close with my brother and we'd grown up so close, we were like twins. And then there was this moment where I began to see our lifelines branching, like deliberately. My father was saying to my brother, this is what you're supposed to become. And to me, this is all that you can't become, and I was like, no. And so I immediately questioned that. But for a long time, I lived under this burden of silence in my house. I wasn't allowed to speak my opinion. I wasn't really allowed to have a voice at all. And it was on the page and it was through poetry that I began to slowly cultivate that rebellion, that little voice that just kept blooming and growing, that eventually came to write this memoir. I wrote it for her, but that little voice that first sprung up and said, no, and to question, well, what kind of woman do I want to be? I do think I have things to say. I think what I have to say is important. And luckily, I followed that voice. And luckily, my mother, in her own quiet rebellion, helped me to nurture that voice. You know, my mother encouraged me. I talked to a lot of Jamaican friends that even outside of Rastafari, there's this idea in the Caribbean that we don't talk about our family. Even we know they hurt us and we know that bad things have happened, but we keep it secret. We don't talk about the things that have happened and the harm that we have experienced. And I kind of rejected all of that, you know, the sort of traditional idea how women should be. And I rejected that and said, no, you know, I have things to say and I'm going to tell the truth and I will give nuance and grace, but I will speak.
We're taking a short break. We're taking a short break.
And that's what I did.
I want to say it almost feels like you were like a bystander in the conversation between Alma and I as we were preparing for our conversation today, because I was thinking of like how to say Babylon as kind of like a long poem, right? So the idea of using poetry as a form of world building, right? So you're saying like poetry was your act first of rebellion, but also the
Yes.
fact that like your mom was a co-conspirator in this kind of world building, right? She was the one who got you your first poetry book and nurtured your love for reading and for knowledge, right? And I thought that was really so profound because, like, while your mom was really trying to be this proof of goodness as a Rastafarian woman, like you're saying, she created a world in which you could begin to question. Right? And I wanted to know, like, after writing the memoir, because for me, I feel like there's a kind of part where you allow your mom a certain type of privacy. So you speak about her up until a moment, right? And then we don't hear about her. But it feels like that was even an act for you to say, okay, she's now left this place and wants to live and part her own life. And I'm giving her this.
Yes.
And I wanted to reflect a little bit about that, right? So kind of this nurturing relationship that she had towards you and your siblings, but also the privacy that you wanted to afford her as a form of reclaiming that kind of agency.
Yes. You know, I owe so much to her and I you know a lot of this book is paying tribute to her and so many of the gifts that she gave me, right? And in writing the book, like I knew it in this sort of hovering metaphorical way, but when I began writing the book and I had to really write down all the moments of my life, all the turning points of my life, I began to see all of them, almost all of them. My mother was a guiding hand, you know, the moment that she handed me my first book of poems that led me to writing my first poem and telling me how much poetry meant to her. And in hopes that it would help me in this like really painful moment, that, you know, I often think back and like, wow, that really changed my life. Like that really changed the course of my life. And that was my mom who did that. You know, I think about how she, you know, convinced my father to let me go study poetry. You know, no matter how that turned out, you know, it was still a moment where I left home for the first time. I felt that what I had to say was important for the first time. I was publishing my poems. That was because of mom. The moment when I wanted to model, somehow my mother convinced my father to let me do it. You know, it was all these moments where I was like, yes. And she'd given me my siblings, you know, or like her educational program. She had tailored for us such a wondrous life and a wondrous education that I can't be anything but grateful to her, you know? And I wanted to be able to tell her side of the story. And through writing it, I came to my own understandings of what she was going through all those years when I was like, you know, a self-involved teenager, not really understanding what it took for her to protect us and to stay there and to, you know, do all the things she did. I began to see that strength looked like different things. Strength didn't always present in one way. And I began to see my mother in a new light. I began to see her strength in a way I had never seen. All of this happened through writing the book. And then at the end, as you say, you know, I give her this moment where she finally leaves, you know, which is how it happened. And she left. And I said, this is what she will make of Esther, you know? And it felt right to do that, but to also, I think, right at the end, come back, bring her back. I'm back at our sea village. I'm back thinking about her and all the women who came before her, and kind of give thanks to them for making it possible for me to be rebellious and loud and, do all the things that I did. It wasn't possible without them and her sacrifice. And so that's kind of how I, I wanted to write it. And it's interesting with a memoir, like I can't just fabricate things, right? Like I would have loved if my mom was there at my final reading and that was how it ended. She wasn't there. So this is the truth of how it went, Yeah.
So I think thinking about that part, I think about memoirizing. And I think about, like you're saying, that you cannot fabricate things, right? These are things
Yeah.
that happened. But I also think that some of that then also means that you have this interesting relationship between memory, between revisitation, because you need to go back in time to some really painful memories sometimes, grace, but there's also distance that time gives you. And so I
Yeah.
wanted to think a little bit about writing from a place of safety and what
Yes.
that looked like in writing your memoir, but also why it was important to write from a place of safety in writing something so deeply personal and true.
Yes. When I first began to write the memoir or began to even think about writing it, not even writing a word, I just left home in this really like harrowing way, violent way. And I think my reasons then for wanting to write it are different than they were now. It was kind of like, I'm going to write my story. I'm going to show you. But that was not a place I wanted to write from. When I tried to write it, it felt painful. It felt too hard. I wasn't sure. Look, I'm a poet. I'm a very sensitive person. I'm porous. I'm like open to all the feelings of the world. And so there were moments where when I was writing it, I was like, I don't know if I will survive this. Like I think it's too fresh. The wound still is bleeding. I was still having nightmares about the things that had happened. It just was not a healthy place to write from. And luckily, I did have that professor who said that you need to write this from a place of safety. And I'm so grateful to him that he said that to me. And I didn't, try to push myself and like say, no, I need to write this now. And so I put it away. I was like, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. This is not the book I want to write. The book that I would have written then 10 years ago would have been so different. And I wouldn't have had time to really process everything, to think through everything. But one, if I'd written it then, it would have had a different ending because I never would have even had any kind of reconciliation with my father, But I put the book away and it wasn't until 5 years after that, it was 5 years of not touching it, that I did go back home and I had that moment where I read my poem. I invited my father to come and, I really said, this is a moment I'm going to seize it to really, again, break the silence for real, face to face, to have him see me as a full-bodied person with my own autonomy, my own dreams and desires for the first time, to speak to him as equals through my poem, which is what I did. I didn't know how he was going to receive it, in front of all those people, in front of a large crowd. You've read the book, This Man Has a Bad Temper. So I was so nervous, but I read the poem to him and I said, I hope you hear me. And I got off the stage and, as you know, he embraced me and he said, I'm listening and I hear you. And I was like, right then it felt something had changed. Something had released from me in that moment. All the burdens, everything I'd been holding so tightly in my chest felt released. And I thought, okay, that was the feeling I was waiting for. That I think now I can begin the book. I felt for the first time that in writing, I had a place of safety, that I was moving toward the place of safety that I needed. Yeah.
Even listening to you now just feels like I'm at a poetry reading, right? I just want to snap my fingers and be like, yes. You know, one of the it's interesting to have read kind of your book, right? And think about, because I have dreadlocks, right?
Yeah.
And to think about like the society in which I grew up in, which is South Africa, and how like a person like me who is a legal practitioner is not supposed to have hair and all of that, right? And how like it's been kind of like very political for me to keep my hair in many instances. But I think about the ways in which you write about hair as this like deeply political, personal, but it also feels like kind of the first sight of protest, right? We know that the first sight can be poetry and writing, but this feels like the first outwardly act of protest, right? I mean,
Yes.
I think I go back to all the women who've cut their hair, right, in the book. And for me, it feels like a deeply political and personal moment, right? And I wanted to
Yeah.
speak a little bit about that, right? That even in 2024, right, hair is still political. But
It's so political, yeah.
to speak to you about kind of that experience, because you know what was really striking for me is kind of the fact that we know when you were younger there was a problem with your hair, right? And then your mom did all of this, and then the dreadlocks came, right? And the kind of treatment you received from having dreadlocks, and then moving from that place to kind of also use this hair to release yourself, right? Kind of from the shackles, right? So I wanted to speak
Yes.
a little bit about that.
I mean, this is like another character in the book, probably the hair. And, we all know as Black people that, and particularly as like femme, like we know hair is a whole universe like held in our hair, right? And it's so fraught so much of the time. And it was something that, oh my God, there was a point in my life where it had overtaken every aspect of my life, it seemed. That my hair, my dreadlocks, and that was really, a lot of it was societal, it was interesting again that they think Jamaica, they think dreadlocks, they think Rastafari, right? But Rastas are less than 1% of the Jamaican population. When my siblings and I began school, we were like among the first Rasta children to integrate public schools in Jamaica. So for a long time, Rasta children weren't even allowed in schools with dreadlocks, right? We've had cases in Jamaica in the last decade of Rasta children. There's a young Rasta girl went to school and the principal just cut her dreadlocks off without her parents' knowledge, and she just got back home and her dreadlocks were cut off. Just last year, the Minister of Education has just now allowed Rasta boys to go to school with dreadlocks without having to cover their hair. So my brother, when he went to school, he had to cover his hair. It was a requirement. So it was all, it literally was political. It was wrapped up in, again, these sort of colonial ideas of what is normal and what is othered. And me and my siblings, for sure, we were othered. A girl, right? Because I think, again, when most people think of Rastafari, they think men. And that's sort of the accepted idea of, the Rasta is, this sort of male presenting, like this is what Rasta is. And in Jamaica, my sisters and I were teased mercilessly by our peers, by people on the street, by, men in the road. And so it began to feel like my hair was no longer a part of me, that it belonged to the world. And it belonged to my father, right? Because he was the one who wanted us to keep the dreadlocks. And no matter how many times I said, well, can I cut my dreadlocks? Can I wear my hair a different way? The answer was always no. So I knew that this part of my body did not belong to me. And not only did it not belong to me, but like if I ever dared cut in my dreadlocks, he wouldn't even it would be a breaking point that he wouldn't even want me in his house anymore, which is not normal, right? Like for you, it's your choice to wear your hair like this. There is no like, you're getting thrown out your house if you cut your hair, right? So for me, it all came back to this idea of my autonomy and my choice. And it felt for so long, especially in those crucial teenage years, that my body didn't belong to me. It belonged to my father. And the longer he denied me my choice to do what I wanted, it felt like it was a deliberate use of power. That it was the thing that kept me bound to him. And it was a way for him to control me into being who he wanted me to be, rather than having me kind of choose for myself who I wanted to be, And, it's an interesting thing that most people don't know is that almost all Rasta girls and Rasta women who are born inside of Rastafari come to this moment. I don't know any of them who still have their dreadlocks. Almost all of them have cut their hair and left the fade, left the movement. And all the men are there still. Like my brother still has his dreadlocks. And he don't have no problems, okay? Like he's good, he's fine. Yeah.
I think, thinking about the characters in the book, your father was a complex character, and I think it's important that you spoke about
I just want to say, I want to jump in the book and I don't know. I want to do something because I, I will tell you this, Safiya. Alma calls me after she finishes the book.
Yeah.
She is seething, right? She is seething. She's like, how dare he? And I'm like, girl, like, girl. Alma, but go ahead. I mean, complex is kind of benevolent.
Yeah, no, I think so much of my anger, just to complete that thought, a lot of my anger was because I have a child. There were things that were unfathomable to me in the book that
Yeah.
that you and your siblings experienced. And I think so much of my anger was premised around that, right? That like as a parent, there are things that should not enter your consciousness to do to your children. And the idea that like your personal convictions somehow outweigh like the responsibility to bear goodness to your children is absolutely wild to me. Like I just could not believe that at any point you could be so angry as a parent that you could harm your children. I was seething. So after I read that book, I was like, what is CPS in Jamaica called? Because I'm gonna call them. Like, what do you call them, right? So I was just like, what is this?
Girl.
Because I was so angry. There were scenes in the book where I had to remind myself that this is not happening at the moment. So there's nothing I can actively do about it, right?
Yeah.
But I guess it's a good way for us to think around your father as this complex character, because in writing this book, I think of your father, and I guess that's why you spoke about the nuances. I think of your father who is a victim of this familial violence and trauma very early in childhood, right?
Yeah.
We see him experience things that no child should ever experience, and then go on to be a perpetrator of the same kind of unspeakable violence in his own family, right? And there's a way in which you write this book that speaks to the honesty of his actions, but also then humanizes him, right? In some ways, we begin to see how the people in our lives are their collective history, their collective traumas, their collective experiences, which is not to excuse that they do to us, but it's also to give meaning for why they behave in the way that they do. And there's a particular scene around capitalism, and I think about how men navigate capitalism, right? How men navigate capitalism and their worth, right? So much of your father's unworthiness comes out when he comes back from Japan and then has to perform at this hotel. And we see deeply how his masculinity and his actual sense of worth is tied in his ability to provide. And often the women in our lives are the people in whom we take out our feelings around our failings at capitalism and our disappointment in life and our disappointments at being unable to make our own dreams come true. And so I wanted to talk about that, how how capitalism and his worthiness or lack thereof manifested in the complexities that we see in the book, and what your reflections are on that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because it's one of the things that I find to be, I think, one of the complexities of my father, right? That he's a man who decries Babylon, but a lot of this stuff, a lot like wanting to be out in Babylon and celebrated was something, that he strove for. And I think his measures of success are also of Babylon. There was that moment where he wanted me to tell him like what every parent at my private school, like what car did they drive and like where did they work? Like he was still kind of interested in this part of the world. So for me, it was growing up, I was like, that's like an interesting, you know, that's not the same thing as what you were saying yesterday. But also because he had this personal conviction that he's a Rasta man, he's a reggae musician, he's never going to do anything else. Okay. So to this day, this is still his position, right? So even if I try to broach with him, like, hey, might you think about some other ways? Like, if you don't have as many shows anymore, might you think of some other ways to, he said, no, this music life is the only life I know. That's the only life I'll ever live. And so for him, even though it wasn't what he would have preferred to do, it was for him the only way he could make sense of it in his mind, that he could still be the reggae musician and he could still be singing with his convictions, but still inside of the hotel,
In the belly
So
of Babylon.
in the belly of Babylon. So I mean, and sometimes I could see how it wore on him being in the belly of Babylon. So I don't particularly have the answers. It was something that he felt that he had to do, and he's gonna continue to do it until, I don't know until what, until he can't do it anymore. I think he feels so strongly that music is what he was put on earth to do, and he doesn't know anything else. And so even if it means being in a place that's antithetical to his beliefs, he'll do it. Yeah, I wouldn't say he's like, yeah, I don't know. I can't speak.
I mean,
I try sometimes to be very like careful about, because people ask me these questions about my father, but sometimes I just don't have the answers, right? Because I still have questions, right? Because there were some
sure,
times where
yeah,
he wasn't a capitalist, he was a
of course.
communist, and he was like talking about Karl Marx, and this is what people were supposed to live in a communist society and so on. And then sometimes he's like, I want to buy a BMW, So, yes, he's a man of multitudes.
Mm. I I just want to have like 2-3 words, because you said something about like kind of the contradictions, right? And
Yes.
we see these contradictions particularly in the way that I think he relates to you, right? So I'm particularly thinking about this scene where you asked him to drop you off at the modeling auditions, right? And he refuses. He refuses to drop you off near the door. And I don't, when I read that, I kind of left the book for a bit and I was like, okay, like, dude, like, come on. Because what do you want from this person? That was me. I'm like, what do you want? So for me, I felt that like the abuse was too much for me, because it feels quite early on in the book and quite early on in the childhood as kind of emotional, right? And then like ultimately it almost became very, very violent, right? And that was deeply kind of like wow, like, I mean, I know we're talking about the place of writing from a place of safety because those things won't happen at the moment. But I'm certain in rewriting, there was a reliving of those particular moments, right? And I want to know, like, how did you feel writing about, as you said, it's a memoir, so you're going to write the truth. But the truth is really painful because this is your father, right? And he's supposed to be there to protect you and nurture you. And most of what we've seen from your childhood is none of the nurturing and none of the protection, but all of the, if you do this, you're not going to be my daughter, right? If you do this, you're not a good daughter. Good daughters do this, right?
Exactly.
And I suppose your reflections about the moments in which you revisited those moments for purpose of writing the memoir, those feelings as a poet, I'm sure you felt still very deeply about the betrayal in many instances. This is someone who's supposed to love you, right? But they don't.
Yes, I mean it was hard to write even after all of that time. These things don't leave you, you know? And then having to kind of not only remember it, then write it down and try to write it as viscerally and as like write it how I remember it, but also, having the reader right there with me. I had to really live in the moment, in the memory. So it was hard. I mean, there were times where I knew what chapter was coming up that I had to write. I was dreading, I'd be dreading it. I wouldn't want to go sit down to the page and write it. There were times where I was crying as I was typing. And then, the thing they don't tell you, as a poet, when I write my poems, is I write it and it's done. That's it, it's done, right? I give the poem. The publisher says, thank you for this amazing poem. And that's it. Like with prose, it's like you write it and then you edit it and then you read it again and you copy edit it, you read the copy edit, then you read it for typos and read it again. I'm like, oh my goodness, how many times do I have to read this? So, I think going in, I didn't think it through. Like, it was just one time. You just get over it. Just write it this one time. Oh, you got to keep reading it and keep reading it. And then they asked me to record the audiobook. So I had to live it truly from my body and my voice. So it was definitely hard. I tried my best to also, I mean, I cut a lot of things out. So I tried to actually even temper like some of the things that are in the book because I know it's a lot. It was a lot for me.
Yeah.
It's a lot for me. I lived it, girl.
I mean, yeah.
It was it's a lot. It's almost something that I was like in writing it, some of it is released from me. I felt that in writing it down, it doesn't live up here anymore. It's now on the page in this book. And then my hope was in writing the book, I could still write something beautiful. Like I know there's all this pain, this hurt, but I wanted as best as I could to take all of that and transform it into something else.
And it was beautiful. So I read the audiobook and the book at the same time. And I was like, ooh, poetry. Like for me, I was like, I want to keep listening, but it's hard. It's hard to keep listening and to keep reading. But you read it out so beautifully that as I said, I thought it was a long poem, but this long poem had lots of stanzas that were different, but still a beautiful, beautiful poem.
Yeah, I wonder, had I read this book before having a child and then read it after having a child, how I would have felt about it. It would have, because the book felt so visceral in many ways. It was, yeah, like you're saying, but to speak about the beautiful things in the book, because I know we've also reflected quite a lot on the heavy things. I want to talk a little bit about your mother, right? And I know we've spoken about the complexity of your father, but I think often we deny women the complexity and the nuance that they deserve, particularly when it is our mothers. And I wanted to think a little bit about like silence in this book. The silence of women in this book holds heavy. In many ways, I guess art mirrors life or whatever that may be, but the silence of the women in this book hold really, really heavy. And I think about how you've had a chance to be older and reflect on how some of that silence is also strength, but some of that silence is also in some ways a betrayal of her own safety to keep you safe, right? And for your preservation, and how the women in our lives have to give up certain things to preserve their children or to preserve their families. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about holding grace for those silences and what your reflections are having written the book and and having had to revisit certain things, but also re-see certain things with the eye of an adult and not a teenager or a child experiencing that.
Yeah, I for a long time when I was growing up, I wanted so badly for my mother to like just rage and just show fury and just like shout like I wanted her. But I couldn't understand that that was just not her personality, right? That was my personality. And even now, she's not that kind of person. Like, a few years ago, she said to me with all sincerity, she's like, I've just realized I don't have to like everyone. And I was like, yeah, you don't. But she said it like such a revelation because she was like telling me about this person that she had met. And she was like, I really just don't know about him, don't really like him, but I feel so bad that I don't like him. And she's like, I realize I don't have to like everybody. I'm like, yeah, mom. So her personality is really just a sort of like calm, patient, like nurturing, loving person. And for a long time, I couldn't understand it. And I wanted her to break that silence. But I realized that it was through her actions, right, that she eventually did break the silence. And that she gave me she eventually, gave me or encouraged me in my own way to break my silence. And she would support my little rebellions in all the ways that she could and still does today. So it was important for me to be able to, when I was writing the book, to also, tell her story and give a full picture of her and her life and the way that she changed and shaped our lives with what she was given and two different ways that people can deal with, being a child of trauma. My father went one way, she went another way, right? My question to myself is, how can I change it? How can I change the future? I want to break this cycle. How can I change it? My siblings do other things, and so they're processing it in different ways. I'm a writer, so I process it in this way. Unfortunately for them, this is how I process it. This is how I break my silence, is by writing our whole lives down. But I wanted in writing the book that I did pay tribute to my mother and the women who came before her, women who had to sort of live and hold these silences. They didn't have a lot of choice, or they didn't always see what different paths they could take. I think now she sees that, and I think sometimes these parts of the book it's hard for her because she said to me like, I wish I'd done this or that different. I'm like, Mom, you can't, don't say that. Let's think about all the good stuff, right? Which is what I tried to do with her in the book. It was like all the amazing things that she did and the balance that she created. So I did want to write the book in tribute to her and all the women who came before her. But also, this moment where I know my niece is coming is the moment that I really decided to pick up the phone. And my father had been calling and calling, and I decided that I'd severed things with him for good. But it was because of my niece, I did pick up the phone because I wanted, if I could at all, to change the kind of family she was being born into or what kind of future she was going to have. I wanted it to be so different than mine. And anything that I could do to facilitate that, I was willing to do.
Mm.
And so, that's kind of like why I picked up the phone, but also why I wrote the book, so that she would know our history and where we came from, but also that she would never have to know the fire, you know?
It's the men, right? The men. These men. For me,
What's wrong with them?
like, what
How
the
much time
hell?
do you have, Safiya? How much time?
So for me, like, I think one thing that really, really infuriated me, right, was similar to the way in which your father is supposed to be this carer, this protector, this nurturer. The old poet comes to be this teacher, right, this nurturer. And for a moment, I'm like, okay, Safiya is, it's about to be poetry. It's about to be winning.
Yes.
And then you see that glass scene, right? You see that scene. I'm still like, you write later on in the book and you say, it's only like later on that you call the moment for what it is, right? Because it was violation, right? And then there is the second violation, which is the hand up the thigh. And I'm like, old man, please, man, can you just stop? And for me, I'm like, it's interesting because it's what your mom says, right? That I had to sit with. Like, but men are this way, like, and you say, like, you, in that moment, your mom was teaching you a very powerful lesson about, like, the way of the world, right? And I'm like,
As she had known
yeah,
it.
yeah, as she had known it, yeah. And I'm like, so I'm just like, I'm sorry to say this, but when he died, I rejoiced. I don't want to lie to you. I rejoiced. I said, thank you, Jesus. Thank you so much, right? And that's really bad, but like, this person is supposed to come and do good things, right? But he sullied all the good things with just the disgust, right? And the entitlement,
Yes.
And then he kisses you in front of your parents. Like, yes, it's on the cheek, but he still does it in front of, like, he was, I just want to say, I'm glad he's dead.
But I think also before you respond, Safiya, is also to think about how people, particularly powerful men, often have these kind of very layered, very complex, and very problematic histories, right? So in some ways, you contribute to this positive influence in the sense that you have the ability to nurture the talents because of course you have access, you have all of these things that allow you to potentially be a good mentor. But because you want to move in the ways of evil men, you are also then capable of perpetuating a violence. So it's like I have to remember you with gratitude for the ways in which you may have shaped some of my talents or mentored me, but also sit with the evil of how you violated that space of trust in ways that made it difficult for me to even trust myself. And it's that duality that I think Latlokonolo and I just struggled with in thinking about the old poet. Like, I mean, like there was no sadness when he passed, but there was a sadness for the ways in which he chose to not be a good person when it mattered.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree. And it was something when that happens to you when you're like 16 or 17, it's very confusing, you know, to work through it, like, wrapped up in this, like you're saying, this idea of this is a powerful person who's publishing my poems, who's like doing all these things for me. And I'm just like, well, what do I do? And then in the moment where I did try to reach out to my mom, like she was not equipped to deal with this. And, she was still in this old tradition of just leave it alone. But I'm not a leave it alone kind of bitch. Like, we're not gonna leave it alone. Right. And so it's funny because I included one of our conversations in the book where he says his worst fear is being written about. So for me, I'm like, I have the last word, and that's it. But to be more serious about it. Like, since this is one of the things that I've gotten the most people reaching out to me in a very surprising way. Not just random readers, people who knew him and who he also did the same things to, worse things to, have reached out to me and said he did the same thing to me. Thank you for writing it down. Thank you for speaking out about it. You know, a lot of people have this idea that if it is like a venerated or distinguished man or whatever, we shouldn't say anything, we shouldn't tarnish the legacy, la la la. But having all these other women who were around him as young women also reach out to me and tell me their stories that they had been violated by him. Our goodness, you know, it's something that I think about from time to time, but I'm glad that I did write about it, you know, that I did not keep silent, but that was never in my nature.
It was never.
So I think, you know, before we close, to think a little bit about your siblings. You know, I think about siblings as anchors and as memory holders, right? They can remind us of things that have happened in our lives. They can be anchors as well because they can remind us of ourselves in some ways. And this book feels like a love letter to kinship. And I think about, you know, you've spoken about your niece and how your niece in many ways was the catalyst for reconciliation, for the repair of relationships. But I wanted to talk about why you wanted to honor your siblings in writing the book in this way, right? So you don't portray them as being perfect, you portray them as being human, but as being good, right? As being kin. And I wanted to know why it was important for you to honor your siblings like this, but also now that you've written the book and it's been published and they've hopefully had an opportunity to read about themselves, what's changed in your relationship with them?
I mean, I wrote it that way because I love them. Love them bad, bad, as we say in Jamaica. Like, you know, I, as the firstborn, you know, always felt the sense of protectiveness over them, of wanting to make sure as best I could the things that happened to me might not happen to them, might not happen to my sisters. Like, you know, these were things that really kept me up at night. But I also know that if it were just me, if I were an only child, if they had never entered my life, I don't know I would have survived. I don't know if I would have survived it all, you know? It was through them and through us being so close and being there for each other and being each other's, you know, best friends and confidants when we weren't allowed to have friends. It could have felt like such a lonely life. But my siblings were the ones that helped make it feel so full, you know? When I think back on a lot of aspects of my childhood, I don't feel like I missed out. I don't feel like it was narrow. I don't feel like it was lonely. There was love, there was laughter, there was joy, and it was because of my siblings. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. It was because of my siblings that I had that. And so I really wanted to write the book in a way that whoever read it could feel skin close my love for them. They too could feel the love I have for them and see that they are good. And they blessed me by being born and coming into my life. Yeah. So that's all. That's what I have to say. You know, I think people are really interested in wanting to know what they think about the book, but a lot of it is hard for them to relive. You know, I'm the one who decided to take this burden on and relive it. You know, that doesn't mean they have to. And I respect that. And I told them that. I said, you don't have to read this. You lived it. And in writing the book, I spoke to them almost all the way through. So the memories there aren't just my memories. It's their memories too. It's, you know, oh, when did we live at that place? Do you remember the name of that person? Like what, you know, what kind of, was it a hibiscus over there? Was it bougainvillea? Like everything, the reconstruction of all of the memories. It wasn't a singular one. It was a collective one. And so it's their memories there too, so that whenever they pick up the book and they're ready to read, they will see themselves there, they will see their lives there, but they will see the love there that I have for them.
Look, I think this is a perfect place to stop, because I felt the love, like you said, skin deep, right? And I was just like, man, yes, that even through the hardship, there is some kingship, right? There are pockets of joy, of solidarity, of holding each other close, right? Of reconciliation and forgiveness. Because I love that in the conversation, I feel the sense of you kind of want to say to each person, your mom and your siblings, to be like, you couldn't have done differently because you didn't know, right? But now we're different. Now we know better and we do better, right? So
Yes.
Safiya, really thank you so much for How to Say Babylon. As you can tell, I'm sure you can tell, we absolutely loved it. I mean, for me, I want to shout on the rooftops about like how everyone needs to read this book, because I think more than this kind of jarring, heart-wrenching, painful story, it's a love letter. It's about that our histories are worthy of being written, our context, right? That in many ways, I feel that like How to Say Babylon is also you saying that as a Jamaican woman, I can also tell Jamaica's history. I am also her daughter. And thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much. I really so appreciate you, and thank you for your support of the book and your kind words and generosity. And I'm so glad and grateful that I got to meet you and talk to you and be in conversation. Thank you.
So thank you, Cheeky Natives. That's it for this week's episode of the Cheeky Natives. Please go out and get yourself the book. I'm sure just off the basis of this very short conversation, you can tell that this is really just like the year of the memoir. And if you don't read this book, I don't know what you're doing. And I think that Safiya continues the tradition of poets writing fantastic memoirs. Tlhokomelo knows that my favorite memoir of all time is Natasha Trethewey, on Memorial Drive. And I think Safiya has convinced me that like if you want to write some memoir, you need to take a course in poetry. This is the hill. This is the hill. If you are unhappy with the statement, come fight me. I'm in Johannesburg. You know where to find me. But thank you so much, everybody, and thank you so much, Safiya, for your generosity. Thank you for your tenderness and your vulnerability. This book is a must read, and thank you for opening yourself, but also opening the world up for a little bit for some of us. So thank you so much, and we look forward to the next episode of the Cheeky Natives. Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Cheeky Natives. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast on all your streaming platforms.